it's very informal. You know, I'm not going to ask for citations, but you guys are
well, you can have them because now I can actually
so. Well, as you guys know, like law is not my field, but I mean, there's a lot of like crossovers between the sort of the work I do and the work you do from different points of view. So, I thought we could do quite a cool episode on violence in general, or aggression and sort of types of aggression. So, kind of the reason why
technically an international crime, aggression.
See,
aggression,
this is good, right? So
it's one that nobody agrees with.
So, like from my side, it's like social science. So I'm very interested in how kind of violence has been sort of like declining, well, you know, obviously into civilized times, and obviously the reasons why that is the case. One of those reasons, I suspect, obviously, is how we sort of codified our law and the way that we like you know construct crime. So which is where you guys come in. So I thought it might be cool if we could start with like, are there like in your world, are there like types of violence, like an aggression? Like, are there differences? How does that work? Like, what's your take on that?
Different types of violence.
What do you mean in our world?
In your legal world?
In the legal world, well, we deal with a lot of different violence depending on what field of law you're in. And since I did international law, I've seen some of them where, well, had to read about some of the worst stuff. I mean, yeah.
I think one of the most interesting things at the moment, I'd say, especially given what's just happened in the US, is kind of the state monopoly on violence, and the fact that like you have police officers who are basically in the US able to shoot people with impunity.
If you're black.
Is quite terrifying a concept. And it kind of reminds me of something I watched a couple of weeks ago, which was basically about kind of how the policing system formed in the UK.
Extra history as well.
I do, and I kind of the discussion about how the police formed in the UK is kind of quite interesting, because it's sort of we still didn't trust police to kind of enforce the laws.
You had a bounty system before that, and most of those bounty
they weren't really
were very corrupt.
What we kind of see as police, really. I mean, they essentially their purpose was to break up like unionization, or you know, to keep
no. This is before. This is in, I think it was like the 1700s, 1800s, like early Victorian, that the proper police force in London came to be.
Yeah, and the Peterloo massacre kind of made people very cautious about giving police guns in this country, because the army shot a bunch of socialist protesters at Peterloo, and
but the other problem was there was a lot of street crime, and you got pickpocketed anywhere you went, so that was a bit of a problem. And so they had these people called thief takers, who were basically bounty hunters, but a lot of them were in cahoots with the thieves, so that didn't go that well. And you needed a bit more detective work. So there were a couple of people who tried to set up proper judges, proper police forces, and to kind of do this right. But it took like 100 years or something from the point that thief takers were considered not a great idea to getting a proper police force that would patrol the streets, that would stop street crime, and that would find and solve crimes, even if you were poor.
Bobbies or peelers.
Yes.
I love the colloquialisms that we call them by in the UK.
Yeah, I mean...
we have so many different dialects. It's wonderful.
In the Netherlands, our cops are very cuddly. I mean...
Yeah, now.
I have seen them arrest people, but usually they're just, if you're reasonable, if you're willing to talk, you don't even get bloody arrested. Like, they are super nice and super reasonable. It's when you, and usually we don't handle things with violence, we just add extra fines. So,
well, yeah, I mean, but it's that difference between like policing via like direct action, kind of like Peterloo, or like whether you police via consent, as in like you police with our permission, kind of thing, isn't it? Which is kind of the way that we feel towards our police now.
It's also a thing where, especially in the Netherlands, I know that our police, some carry guns. I don't think all of them do. And they can use a gun. They've gotten tasers recently, but they're already being cautioned against them, because they're like, well, you know what, maybe we shouldn't use the tasers too much because they can be quite bad, especially when it's people who have mental illnesses or older people. Maybe we shouldn't tase them.
Yeah, but
I mean, in my first week in the
yeah.
Netherlands, I witnessed quite a brutal arrest. Like, it was like one guy and 6 police officers kind of all bringing this guy, bundling him onto the ground and slamming him against the police van.
Was this at a night out?
No, this was the morning.
Well, usually they're quite friendly. I mean, if it's a night out and somebody is drunk and rowdy and just not being reasonable, they will get to that point at some point. But you have to really go far to do that sort of stuff. Usually in the Netherlands, it's, right, we're going to give you a warning. Oh, we want to see your ID. You don't have ID, or you're talking back to us. Now you get a fine. Then you get another fine and another fine. And I have seen people back chat against police and against like ticket checkers in trains so much that a €10 fine ended up costing them €700. Don't backtalk to our cops.
No,
I mean, they're
obviously
very
not.
reasonable.
And yeah, but I mean,
They're not
kind of what
violent.
you're on about before, as in like the one, as in like certain police officers obviously armed now with firearms. That's kind of like in response to like a new form of violence, isn't it? Terrorism, which is obviously something that they've not previously had to deal with for a long time.
Well, with us, it's very special police that have like the visible guns. And after there's been an incident in Europe, I have had times when I went with the train, where the big train stations that were armed, like SWAT force police with really big guns.
Yeah.
Which to me was one of the weirdest experiences ever. However, France, in Paris, there's always police like that at every station, all the time. There's a difference between the kind of violence that is inherent in certain places where you see that there's still a massive divide in wealth and class, especially along racial lines, because Paris with the Baligneux, I mean, they have a bit of a race problem there as well. And you see that there's also these really big violent riots where they, if somebody gets killed by police, they will set the world on fire. And
yeah, but the French always do that for anything. That's what they do.
Yeah, to import cheeses, we riot.
Exactly.
Core of discontent that you see in the US, and the same almost arms race that the police say we need more stuff because we don't feel safe, so give us bigger guns. So they use the bigger guns more often, they get more violent, and thus people say we're being repressed, we're going to get more rioting, which leads to the police feeling more.
I mean,
it's the us versus them.
True. That is true. And especially in America as well, it's even worse, where they're able to access like military grade hardware.
Yeah.
And it's not just that. In America, the idea that these people are bad, that these people are inherently evil, is so ingrained in even their laws still. I mean, it's things that we can barely imagine. I mean, one of the things that's the most shocking for me is every year they have the caucus, and they ask you your race, and they ask you your religion, and the government just puts it on file somewhere. That is illegal in the Netherlands. Because in the Second World War, what happened was we had registers like that, and the Nazis used it to find the Jews and deport them. So in the Netherlands and in a lot of European countries, governments are not allowed to even keep a record of such things. They're not allowed to keep a record of sexual orientation, of race, of religion, any of those things, because of the risk of prosecution.
One should always be skeptical of lists.
Lists are the devil.
Yeah, these sorts of lists. I mean, lists that divide people into certain groups. I mean, they're very useful for sociologists and for statisticians. Yes, indeed. They're very useful for that. They're very good for research. The problem is, if they're in the wrong hands, they make it really, really easy to go, oh, well. I mean, one of the things about American institutionalized racism is very similar to the non-discrimination principle in Europe. So they officially said you're not allowed to discriminate people on basis of race or skin color. You're not allowed to do that. So what did American governments, especially local governments, start doing? They went, okay, we're not going to discriminate on that. We're just going to find things that black people have more often than white people and bugger them with that.
Welcome to racial profiling, yeah.
But it's also things like, oh, if we're gonna make a highway, let's run it through the neighborhood that has more black people because they're poorer, so it's cheaper to buy the land. Other such things. Poor areas have worse schools. They happen to be mostly black. There's worse public transit. There's worse facilities. Parks don't get built, etc., etc., etc. And these, in the EU, if that would happen, they would call that indirect discrimination. They would say, well, if it still hits immigrants or migrants or people of not your own nationality, mind you, this is only EU member states. So it's like if a British person came to the Netherlands and you guys had to pay higher taxes or higher something, or you weren't allowed to do certain jobs because you're British and you're not Dutch, that would be considered direct discrimination. But if they were like, oh, but we want you to know the language because otherwise you can't have this job, that would be indirect discrimination.
Your cat does not agree.
The cat wants attention, I
That is a
assume.
racist cat.
No.
Just putting out there.
No,
Just
he
putting out
isn't.
there.
He doesn't even know race. I don't think he's ever seen.
I'm so woke, he doesn't even know what race is. He's way beyond those concepts.
No, he's a cat. That's kind of the thing. But yes.
What is race and laws but constructs we build as society?
Was two guest starring and trying to nick my scarf.
Oh.
But no, it's interesting. I see this quite often where a lot of the sneaky ways that American racism is still in their laws is what we in Europe, if it was nationalities based, would consider indirect discrimination and not good. This is why if you want to study in the Netherlands, if you're an EU citizen, you pay the same rate as we do.
Which was fantastic.
Yes. Well, people from outside the EU have to pay the institute rates, which are about 4 times as much. So which is why if I wanted to study in Sweden as a Dutch person, I would have to be treated as if I was Swedish, which means no tuition fees at all, because they don't charge those. And the EU is quite vehement about this, because otherwise the whole free movement thing kind of gets buggered, you know? Otherwise it doesn't work. So it's fascinating to see a similar problem, only they don't use nationality, but they use race and they use ethnicity.
Well, you know, you were saying before how like their kind of violence is kind of like it's so much more like moral and kind of like based in their kind of like religion and their kind of beliefs. If you think like how we tend to think about violence, well, I think more so in Europe, it's much more like kind of like you know, there's like mitigating circumstances, or you know, maybe they were abused, or we tend to kind of see things a bit more like holistically, I suppose. Whereas in American system, it's like, no, he's evil. He's got the devil in him. And much more that kind of like black and white, fire and brimstone.
And it's also like why they still have the death penalty in quite a few states. And like the amount of people that basically are on death row and kind of the legitimization for essentially the state's monopoly on being able to kill people is ridiculous. And like here, we've gotten rid of it. Though there are debates in the UK about bringing the death penalty back, which terrible idea. The monopoly on state violence kind of taken to that extreme is obviously, oh yes, we should be able to execute people
Well, if you want
based
to
on the
know,
outcome of a trial, which can never be guaranteed that somebody found guilty is actually 100% guilty, unless
Nope.
they confess to
even
being the
that's
criminal.
not
And
100%.
even then,
I
like,
mean,
Yeah,
there's
false,
if they
so
were
many
false
caught in,
confessions.
if they were caught in the act, then it's still like you can't execute them because you move down that slippery slope.
If you want to know how important the death penalty still is to the US, there's this brilliant story I got told in international in one of my international law courses in my first year, because we started noticing that every single international treaty, unless it was about trade or military means or something that the US wanted, they were never a part of it. If it's about general rights, if it's about the environment, if it's about human rights, stuff like that, they are never a part of it. They always don't even, maybe they sign it, but they definitely don't ratify it. And I may have to explain the difference between signing and ratifying in a second. Which is actually an important difference to explain. I'll explain. Signing a treaty means that you cannot go against the spirit of the treaty. You have agreed to it in general, while ratifying it, which means that your local government and your parliament has had a say in it and has had a vote on it and has decided we accept this as law, means that you can no longer break the treaty unless you stop being a party to it. So unless you decide to bugger off. So there was the Treaty of the Rights of the Child. Now this is a treaty that is universally pretty well accepted because, yeah, let's give children some rights. And there's this thing, because states cannot be, there's this concept in international law based on sovereignty called consent to be bound. So states cannot be forced to do something they do not explicitly agree to. Which means that when you're making a treaty, states have the right to have exceptions. And usually at the back of a treaty, there's all these little exceptions, like Bangladesh wanted an exception to Article X and Y, so they're not bound to that. France wanted an exception to this number, etc. Usually they're small, and these exceptions cannot go against the spirit of the treaty. Now, with the Treaty of the Rights of the Child, the USA wanted an exception. They wanted an exception to the right to life, because then Texas could still condemn minors to the death penalty. This was kind of seen as going against the spirit of the whole treaty. I mean, the right to life is kind of the basis of saying children are allowed to have education and safety and food and a house. It's kind of, if you're not allowed to live, that's...
The right to life is like the catch-all right, really, when you think about it.
Most countries will sign on to that, really. It's like, it's a given.
Yeah,
you like hair? Yeah, you can have, it's fine.
They were literally not allowed to sign that treaty, even, let alone try to ratify it, because they wanted that exception, unless they accepted the right to the life for children, which would mean that Texas would have to abolish the death penalty for minors, which they didn't want to do. This is how important that stuff is to certain Americans.
Do you not think, though, like it's like as like a form of torture or justice, it's remarkably like inefficient. Like most of them die on death row before they're even executed. So like, do you think most of its power is just the fact that it's like symbolic, I suppose, isn't it? As like
it's a bit like in the courts in the UK, there used to be a thing known as the black cap, which is when a judge was giving the death sentence, they'd put this little piece of black cloth over their wig as they condemned someone to death. And every criminal courtroom, I think, in the UK still actually has the black cap.
Just sitting on the side, just
sitting on the side.
If it ever comes back, we still got it.
Yeah. So there's sort of the symbolism of the death penalty, especially in the UK with the black cap, is quite shocking.
Yeah.
But I think the other strange thing about the US having kept the death penalty is the fact that in their constitution, under the Bill of Rights, there's the amendment that says that they shall prohibit cruel and unusual punishment.
The death penalty wasn't really unusual back in the day. I mean, it
True,
was actually
but
quite
Seems
common.
it now.
I mean, if you take a more modern reading of it,
Yes,
which
yes.
most of these rights technically are vague enough to be interpreted over time. Good
Well, it's a
common
living
law,
document, so it's supposed to kind of be updated and
Good-
reinterpreted all the time. And
a good common law writing constitution, to be honest. And it's the whole fact that like nowadays, like they get round like the cruel and unusual punishment for torture by torturing people not on American soil, i.e. Guantanamo Bay.
technically still against international law because the prohibition against torture is part of the use commune.
Yes,
Sorry,
but the
you
US, once it's not on US soil, they probably don't give a toss.
No, the whole problem with the US being able to do whatever they want is the same as China and Russia, is because they are veto members of the UN Security Council. And, well, the UN Security Council is who decides if you can go to war or have sanctions, even economical sanctions, against the country. So they can basically just do whatever they want. The UK is the same. The only reason they can't is because so far the EU has kept them in check because, interestingly, the EU isn't an international organization, it's a supranational organization because when you join it, you give them part of your sovereignty, which is exactly what Brexiteers are angry about. And is very silly.
Brexiteers basically just want to have the right to go to war with France.
Yes.
And so they should, sir.
Which would still be a problem.
The age-old tradition.
Yes, go to war with France. Because we can.
Just a quick one on the death penalty because I was reading about it not so long ago. Are you aware that they always had two guards? And like I didn't know why they had two guards, but it's quite a
Prevent
funny
them from
rule.
suicide, probably.
No. So like they basically both have like a button, right? So when they're doing the execution, they both press the button, and essentially one of them, it's like a randomized switch system. One of them will administer the death injection.
So you never know who did it.
So you never know who did it. Yeah, it's okay. Otherwise, they would have
alleviating their
trouble
own guilt then.
Yeah,
I did not know that. That is quite an interesting fact.
Yeah.
I do know it often goes wrong. And people don't get anesthetized or only
the excruciating
pain.
The excruciating pain I've heard of some of the stories is awful.
Well, it's sometimes the anesthesia doesn't take. Sometimes they botch injections, so they have to.
There's two, isn't there? They use 2 injections. And I think one is
like 3 or 4. It's a lot of different stuff. There's one that's the anesthesia that kind of makes you feel nothing. Another one that's a paralytic that makes you unable to move and speak. And then there's the actual lethal concoction. I think it's 3 in total. But sometimes, if one of the first 2 malfunctions,
wrong order or something.
Deep shit. And sometimes the lethal concoction isn't actually lethal, so there have been stories of people who've had to go through that process 3 or 4 times.
Yeah. Got horribly wrong. Or they feel everything, and then they wake up afterwards and tell you.
Because there is no way to check if somebody is really anesthetized when they're paralyzed. You just don't know. They can't scream.
Yeah. It's a bit like what happened with hanging in the UK. It always started as a public spectacle, and as time went on, we just kept making the drop longer so that essentially it would kill the prisoner instantly by snapping their neck. And so it was like seen as becoming more humane rather than leaving them to dangle and choke to death.
Yeah, it's not quite as enjoyable to watch.
Well, it's also a thing that you need to remember that imprisonment for a long amount of time is actually a really new thing. I think like in the 1800s, the Netherlands started with it because we were humanists and we decided, you know what, we can reform people through a workhouse so they have a certain amount of time that they have to work for the
pesky age of reason.
Then they're good. Yeah. But the thing is, before that, if you did a crime and you were punished, basically they would either give you lashings, cut your hand off, or sell you into temporary slavery, which is actually the humanist version. So really it was, physical punishment, or you paid a fine, which meant that the rich never got bloody whipped, but the poor always did. And after a while, they decided that's not very humane. The only people in like before 1700 or 1800 who got imprisoned for a longer time were very, very prominent nobles or rich people who you literally couldn't kill because that would cause some trouble, usually.
Yeah.
You locked them in a castle where they got sent books in a chest.
Yeah. I'm not sure if it was different for you guys, but over here, like, you had to pay for your like food and board in prison. Like,
Yeah, I remember
I'm
those
not
stories.
sure exactly how it's done.
They
here.
also
I
had
think,
the beggars' grate, where they'd have people who begged for money outside of the prison to pay their
yeah,
prison
I know that the
fee.
Victorian workhouses were
Fascinating.
awful, but is it still the case right now that people have to pay for room and board when they're in
No,
prison?
no, yeah, we
Oh,
reformed. Those reforms happened a while ago.
I think for a while
Along
it
with
was
getting
like
rid
this
of
here as
debtors'
well.
prison, because we
Yeah.
once thought
Yes.
being in debt should be punished by locking people up.
I am going to throw a hot potato out there. I think the concept of indentured servitude and, to a certain degree, the workhouse isn't necessarily a bad thing for people who are in bad debt. But, there's the big but, it cannot be used as moralizing or punishment. It has to be a place where people can live without having to, like, their basic needs are provided and the work they do is taken off their debt. Basically, the government takes on your debt and you work it off with what skills you have, or you try to improve yourself, etc. Because then it is actually a way out for people instead of being under crippling debt forever and ever and ever, because the debtor is going to take your money anyhow. They're just going to, you know, have a claim on it and just take half your paycheck. On the other hand, and then you start getting debts with other things like rent or facilities, etc.
It sounds like
Oh, we got unlimited
community service, really.
kind of, but in a slightly, like, over here we have a debt clearance scheme. If you are in bad debt, and it's becoming a real problem, there is a way that you can get into a program where for 3 years you have no control over your own finances. You basically have somebody who does everything for you, gets all your money in, and gives you an allowance to live off, and that's it. And they make deals with your debtors, they get you on payment schemes, they organize everything, they do all of that. And after 3 years, even if there's still any debt left, it's just cleared. But for those 3 years, you are 100%, you have basically nothing. But it's a way out. It's a way out for people who, through misadventure or poor planning or whatever circumstance, have racked up hundreds of thousands of euros of debt or thousands of euros of debt, who just otherwise would not be able to pay for it. And I think that it's actually a pretty decent scheme because you don't go bankrupt. But it's kind of similar, like after 3 years they go, okay, it's all gone, but you don't have to sell your stuff, you don't have to lose your car, you don't have to do any of that.
It's a system that makes sense. There's logic to it, rather than the UK personal insolvency stuff where it's like, oh yes, you're bankrupt, you've got to sell the house, you've got to sell the car, and it just like...
Well, I think you can't get into this program unless you've already done a lot of those things, but they will seek, like, if you need your car for work, of course they're not going to make you sell it because that is dumb. And if you have children dependent on you and paying for a house is cheaper, paying your mortgage is cheaper than paying rent, or there is not enough rental space for you to get something at a decent price, of course they're going to let you keep your house. However, they are going to look at how they can pay back as much as possible. So anything that's surplus, they will try to get you to liquefy. But it's usually these are people that end up in these schemes who already have nothing left, who are on the dole basically, who live in small rental apartments and just bought things on pay schemes that they can't afford, or ran into a short period of debt and started getting bad loans at exorbitant interest rates just to pay, filling a hole with a hole, and the hole just getting bigger. Stuff like that. Or sometimes people who had a lot of fines and didn't realize or ignored them, and it just snowballed. Usually the biggest debtor is the taxman and fines in the criminal justice system here.
Not that I don't find tax interesting.
Yes,
right?
we were talking about violence.
One, it was violence, and two, we've got like 7 minutes left, so I want to get you on some other questions before we go, right? So
I don't think we're going to get to genocide. Sorry.
Well, funnily enough, that's the one, because last time you're like, we should like kind of like try and like define genocide, and I was like, yeah, we'll do another one. Well, we're going to do it now. What's the difference between just like generic murders and like genocide? Like, at what point does it become legally kind of like a genocide?
So there is another crime you need to know about before you can go, oh, there's murders and there's genocide. No, there's murders, crimes against humanity, and genocide.
I thought that was just a card game.
No, that's Cards Against Humanity. This is Crimes Against Humanity, which is a lot older, which is what the Nazis were actually tried for, because they were technically never tried for genocide because it wasn't a crime yet. History. Anyhow.
Yeah, the other thing with genocide and just murder is usually a quantity. It's usually one of the main.
Not necessarily.
Ooh, controversial.
The thing is, the definition of genocide is extremely limited. So it is the whole or partial physical destruction of a group of racial, ethnic, national, or religious grounds. There's a lot of different things that can constitute genocide, but it has to. But if you say if it's a very small protected group, an ethnic group that there's only like 50 left of, killing one of them or even two could actually impact that group to a point that it could be seen as the whole or partial destruction of.
Okay.
Another important factor is it has to be systemic. It doesn't necessarily have to be government run. Like in the Rwanda genocide, you saw that the government was there was a bit of a civil war going. So it wasn't actually the government that was getting people to kill Tutsis, but it was the other faction, and it was definitely a controlled and contrived systemic attack. Even though it was very chaotic, they called for people to go out and kill Tutsis and kill their neighbors. It was literally machetes in the night. It was one of the most grueling conflicts. They killed about 70% of Tutsis in 3 months. It's mind-boggling. But that would be, even though it's not the government necessarily that is saying, oh, we're going to go kill people. However, it has to be systemic. So it can't just be a random lone wolf or loose things. There has to be a system in place that is trying to eradicate or kill this group of people.
Yeah, that is quite surprising. I just assumed that there was like a number threshold that you hit, and it was just genocide.
Yeah, I think one of the usual things is because most cases of genocide that have been tried and dealt with are usually those that are in the masses, like where it's over thousands of people.
The reason why that is because states are very reluctant to call something genocide, because it is very hard to prove, because a core element is that the genocidaires, as they call them, have to have a genocidal intent. So it's murder not just to kill a Jew, but it's to destroy the Jews. The reason we're doing this, and this is why also sometimes rape can fall under it, or forced movement, or those things can all fall under genocide if the intent is to destroy and eradicate and wipe out this group of people. However, interestingly, originally when genocide was thought of as a crime, they also wanted to include philosophical or political affiliations, etc. So you couldn't just kill the opposition or try to eradicate all the commies. But that's when Russia and America started kind of going head to head, and we started getting the run up to the Cold War, and communism was becoming the red danger. So, and Russia didn't want to not be allowed to fight against capitalism. So they kind of didn't add that to the protected groups, which means that if you kill all, say, if in the UK the Tories decided, or the Brexit Party decided to just start killing all Labour voters and all Labour members, this would not technically be genocide. It would be a crime against humanity. That's the difference. The difference is...
I mean, they kind of are, just really slowly.
Hey, I'm a Labour voter now.
He's a reformed Tory. But no, it's crimes against humanity can be way more than just murder. It can also be forced relocation. It can, all the things, it's a very old crime. It's all the things that we say, that's human dignity. You can't do that as a government or as an army or as a rebel group, etc. And it is a lot easier to prove crimes against humanity because you only have to prove that it was systemic and that it was that those in power or the people who did it had an amount of control about of the area and were using that control or that power to do these crimes.
Right. So you're saying that until like the Nazis, then we only had this crimes against humanity, and then they were like, okay, we need like a higher level
because of how atrocious it was. On the other hand, the reason why the Holocaust had such an impact, there were genocides before that, which would technically fall under genocide, but legally technically aren't because it's not a crime until it's proven, and you can't have a crime. An action can't be criminal until it's...
Because there's loads of examples of, well, but essentially like genocides that were never classified as that.
Yeah, like, for instance, the Trail of Tears in the US, where they were just migrating all the Native Americans off the land, technically is a genocide.
Well, that would actually be considered a crime against humanity still, because I am not 100% sure that their reason for trying to do that was the physical destruction of that group, because they did eventually give them a place to live. It just wasn't
constantly got smaller and smaller.
Yes, but that would be forced relocation, which is a crime against humanity. However, if it's paired with a lot of violence and a lot of murder, that can eventually go into genocide. But as you see, genocide is an incredibly tricky crime to actually prove, and this is why it's especially hard to get to the top guys, because that's the ones you want. You don't want to have the foot soldiers all indicted and prosecuted for genocide and convicted of it, but the president goes free. This is why the Nazi defense, we haben es nicht gewusst, we didn't know it, is such a strong defense because it attacks this intent. If you didn't know about it, then how can you have this intent? And there's a lot of tricky ways that we've found, like command responsibility. Well, you were in command, so you should have known.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. How we're trying to get around that, but it's still incredibly tricky. And another reason why a lot of genocide cases simply aren't prosecuted is because it's usually disenfranchised groups, and a state or a group has to have enough power to actually bring it to an international court. And this is the interesting thing if we look at the Israel-Palestinian conflict. The reason why Israel will never stop building settlements has to do with statehood and effective control. So there's two things that make a state a state. It's being recognized by other states and treated as such, and which is the judicial component, and then there's the actual material component of having a territory with inhabitants that you have effective control over. The problem for Palestine right now is it cannot be a state because they can't protect their own borders, basically. Israel is telling them what to do. It's bullying them, basically. So they
Yeah.
don't have effective control over their territory, which is what undermines their statehood. The moment that Palestine becomes a state, they can recognize the International Criminal Court and bring a crimes against humanity / genocide case for how they have been treated by Israel. This would harm Israel immensely internationally, given that they quite often play the genocide, we were victims of genocide, we need our own state card, which
And
is a massive problem for them. So if they stop building these settlements, and if they go, okay, you know what, Palestine, you have your own borders, and we'll respect them, and we'll not cross them, and we will let you do what you want, that makes them a state, which then gives Israel problems, which they do not want.
Because it gives them rights, essentially. So they basically don't exist.
Legally, right now, they don't exist. At least not for international courts. Not it. The Palestinian people, as a people, could possibly, but they still need a state sponsor to have a say in. I mean, the problem with the International Criminal Court is it only has jurisdiction over states or
and allow it to have jurisdiction
that have recognized it. Again, consent to be bound. A state cannot be bound unless they want to be, which is why America and Israel and a lot of these Arabian and African states have not recognized it, because there has been a lot of shit there, and they could get pulled in front of the court for that as well. And it's a PR nightmare to get accused of genocide in your country or to get accused of crimes against humanity. You don't want that. It just ruins your
carries a huge like moral weight to it, isn't it? It's not just like the possible penalty to.
It's the crime of crimes. Literally, that's how it's described in my law books. It's considered the crime of all crimes.
So is there like a hierarchy then? Like, is that like the worst of the worst of all crimes, genocide?
It is international law considered the worst of all crimes. It is part of what we call the jus commune, which is habitual law that is binding for everyone, even if states protest. It's the only exception to the consent to be bound, the prohibition of genocide, the prohibition of torture, and there's one more thing that I can't get into in my head right now, but there's like very few of these very specific things that we just went, chemical weapons is also on the jus commune, that you don't use those. It's these things that we have just decided are way too atrocious, and weapons of mass destruction, so chemical weapons and nuclear weapons fall under that. These are the things that we as humanity have used once, seen go wrong once, and just went, no.
Isn't it weird how like we can in a sense like inflict so much like hurt and violence to one another, but there's just certain things that are just like a university agrees to be off limits. Like, there's like an invisible line somewhere. Like,
well, we do have these agreements about where this line exists. I think there are countries that have seen themselves as the exception for all, like the US, for instance, in Vietnam, the use of Neymar, the use of napalm and Agent Orange in Vietnam.
Well, that's one of the problems with the reason why these things sometimes happen is the goal justifies the means. And if you think away from people being people long enough and think us and them long enough, you will eventually just start to justify these sorts of things.
Yeah.
And that is the scary part. That's why we have decided that these are such important issues that we cannot let happen. Because an interesting case is the case of Carthage in ancient Roman times.
You have 5 minutes to solve all problems of Carthage, by the way, and it's going to cover.
Okay. 5 minutes to solve Carthage.
Short history of the concept of Carthage. Carthage and Rome. Rome was just beginning to be an important state in the Mediterranean and just become a republic. And Carthage was kind of the big guy at that time, at least, but they were more traders. At the time, it was the norm that if an army threatened your main city of your city-state, you would just freaking surrender, pay them off, and they would walk away. That was the norm in international conflict. So cities were rarely razed and rarely taken. It was mostly, we're threatening your city. Haha, we're in your home city. Okay, we'll give up. However, Rome did not do this when Hannibal went over the mountains after Rome had bullied Carthage into a really bad treaty. And so but he stood in front of Rome, and Rome kind of got this scar mentally in their identity of, but we were almost destroyed. We could have been fucked. So they decided Carthage was the enemy, and they started, clipping its wings through treaties, and they weren't, Carthage wasn't allowed to have an army anymore unless Rome was okay with it, and they, of course, chose the wrong sides, although they were very partial in that. And eventually Carthage was like, okay, either we're going to get raided and our city's going to get razed, or we raise an army now to defend ourselves. They did that. Rome went, you know what, that's an excuse. We're going to go over and we're going to burn the city to the ground, which they literally did. They wiped it off the map so thoroughly that for hundreds and thousands of years, nobody knew where the fuck it was. And we thought it was just a legend until we actually found it. They killed, it was a city of like 500,000 people before Christianity. Like, it was massive, and only 50,000 people survived and were taken as slaves. Everyone else died in 2 weeks of them systematically burning the city to the ground. It's atrocious, but the way they justified
we've come a long way. We've come a long way.
No, but the way they still had to justify it to the other city-states, because otherwise they would have definitely ganged up on Rome, going, "This is unacceptable." So Rome spread stories, or we're not sure if it's actually true or not. It's highly debated, but what they said was Carthage was doing human sacrifice. They were sacrificing infants to their gods, and that is why we had to wipe them off the map. And if you look around, justifications for genocides and for taking people's lands and for deciding people weren't human,
make them less than human. That's how you do it.
They were usually along the lines of they're cannibals or they are non-Christian and they're heathens. Those are the two things that we used, even in colonial times.
Yeah, it was quite common to use witch trials against sort of Native Americans and escaped slaves in the early days of the colonies to kind of get them. And witch trials are some of the most bonkers events in sort of English legal history, and kind of helped form the basis for the rules of evidence. Because when it was all happening, English lawyers were like, well, why are you doing these trials? And they're like, there's no evidence. Like, these people weren't represented by lawyers, and in the end it kind of started to become what would eventually be the initial rules of evidence and the burden of proof. But it's that whole thing about, oh yes, your crimes are like cavorting with the devil, you're a heathen, and it's if you could say, because there was already a concept in colonial times of that the land belonging to the people who lived there. The only land you could just take was land belonging to people who you could prove could not govern it. So, and usually reasons for this were, oh, but they're cannibals, they're not human, they're not sophisticated, they're barbarian. Or it was, they're heathens and they refuse to accept God, and that's why they cannot govern their land, and that's why we should take over. It's these excuses. If you look at colonial history, it's why early accounts of every single native people has such things as, ooh, they eat people, ooh, they sacrifice their children, stuff like that. It's all in there because that gave us the idea in Europe that we were better, and thus we should take care of this land and we should take it from them, because they weren't using it, they were malusing it, they were terrible, they're not really human. We are the sophisticated good people of God and we should take care of this. We're doing them a favor. That kind of bullshit. The first colonial settlers in the UK were so inept they could not survive the first winter without the natives' help. Which I always find a ridiculous story.
But we also think that the Americas were this wild land with nothing being governed or being cultivated.
Oh yeah, Columbus arrived. No one's here. It's all good. No one's here.
Which actually makes me want to talk about one of my favorite kind of legal historical things that I do want to read more about, which is the Great Law of Peace, which is the sort of one of the foundational sort of ideas behind sort of the US Constitution, to be honest. And I do want to read more about it and discuss more of it. So
yes, we will have to prepare for that someday.
Yeah.
My guys, we're out of time. We're out of time.
I figured.
Alas, not enough time in the world to discuss these important things.
No,
Yes,
it's almost like violence is complicated or something. I don't know what's going on.
Yeah, it's almost like law degrees are complicated and lawyers should be paid a lot. Oh my god.
Gonna need an episode 3.
Yay!
Delightful.
That's it. Well, more cheery subject next time. Victorian sexual practices. Yeah?
Oh, interesting.
Yes.
Yeah.
I will look at my smut.
Well, thanks, guys. It's been fun.
All right.
Take care of yourselves. Yeah. Cheers, guys.
Yes, you too. Take
Bye.
care.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care. Bye. Yeah.